The autumn sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Henderson's Bar and Grill in Fort Mason, Virginia. It was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone, where military families had put down roots for generations, and where the local watering hole served as a second home to retired service members. Sarah Mitchell pulled her modest sedan into a space near the back, taking a moment to steady herself before going inside. At 58 years old, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that came from 3 decades of military service. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a plain navy sweater. Nothing about her appearance suggested the extraordinary career she'd had. Inside Henderson's, the Friday afternoon crowd was beginning to gather. Sarah spotted her destination immediately, a large corner booth where her 4 closest friends from the service were already seated. These women had been through everything together. They'd served in wars, survived impossible situations, and built a bond that time and distance could never break. "Sarah," called out Margaret Chen, waving her over. Margaret, at 62, was the oldest of the group and had the sharp eyes of someone who never missed a detail. Sarah smiled and made her way through the restaurant. As she walked, she noticed a group of 5 men at the bar, all appearing to be in their late 40s or early 50s. They wore expensive casual clothes and had that particular swagger that came from success and privilege. She paid them little attention. "Sorry I'm late," Sarah said as she slid into the booth. "Traffic on Route 17 was terrible." "You're always apologizing for nothing," said Diana Rodriguez, the youngest of the group at 55. Diana had a warmth about her that immediately put people at ease. "We just got here ourselves." The other 2 women, Patricia Williams and Jennifer Clark, both 60 years old, greeted Sarah with genuine affection. These 5 had served together in some of the military's most challenging assignments, though you'd never know it to look at them now. They looked like any other group of older women enjoying a Friday afternoon together. They ordered drinks and appetizers, falling into easy conversation about their lives. Margaret talked about her grandchildren. Patricia shared stories about her new hobby of painting. Jennifer complained good-naturedly about her husband's obsession with golf. Diana described the garden she was planning for spring. Sarah listened more than she spoke, as was her nature. She'd always been the quiet one, the steady presence who could be counted on but never sought the spotlight. Even now, retired for 2 years, she found comfort in letting others take center stage. Their food arrived, and the conversation continued. They were laughing about an old memory from their service days when one of the men from the bar approached their table. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of confident stride that came from never being told no. "Excuse me, ladies," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across several tables. "My buddies and I couldn't help but overhear you talking about the military. We're all veterans ourselves." Margaret looked up politely. "That's nice. Thank you for your service." The man didn't take the hint to leave. Instead, he leaned against the side of their booth, clearly having had a few drinks. His 4 companions had turned on their bar stools to watch, grinning. "So what did you ladies do in the service?" he asked. "Nurses, administrative work. My mom was a secretary at Fort Bragg back in the day." There was something condescending in his tone that made Sarah's jaw tighten slightly, but she said nothing. Diana's smile became fixed and polite. "We served in various capacities," Patricia said evenly. "It was a long time ago." "Oh, come on," the man said, gesturing broadly. "Don't be modest. Let me guess, you worked in personnel. Supply chain, those are important jobs too, you know. The military can't run without good support staff." His friends at the bar were laughing now, clearly enjoying the show. Jennifer's eyes narrowed, but Margaret placed a gentle hand on her arm. "We appreciate your interest," Margaret said with forced politeness, "but we're just trying to have a quiet meal with friends." Sure, the man said, but he didn't move. "But seriously, I'm curious. What ranks did you ladies reach? I made it to captain myself, infantry, 2 tours in Iraq." The way he said it made it clear he was proud of his service, as he should be. But there was an underlying assumption in his words, that whatever these women had done, It couldn't possibly compare to his experience. Sarah felt Diana shift uncomfortably beside her. She knew her friends well enough to sense their rising irritation. They'd spent careers proving themselves in a male-dominated field, and even in retirement, they still encountered this attitude. "We did our jobs," Jennifer said curtly, "just like you did yours." "Hey, no need to be defensive," the man said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just making conversation. You know what? This could be fun. Let's make it interesting." He turned and called to his friends at the bar. "Gentlemen, come over here. These ladies served too. Let's compare notes." The other 4 men approached, all wearing similar expressions of amused superiority. They ranged from a stocky, red-faced man to a thin, balding one, but they all shared the same swagger. "Ladies," the first man said with an exaggerated bow, "allow me to introduce my Friday afternoon drinking club. This is Marcus, former Marine, made it to Major. That's Tom, Navy Lieutenant Commander. The big guy is Dave, Army, also a captain like me. And the quiet one is Steve, Air Force Major." The men nodded and grinned at the women, who returned their stares with neutral expressions. "We were just discussing military service," the man continued. He stuck out his hand to Margaret. "I'm Rick, by the way, Rick Donovan, so come on, ladies, just tell us your ranks. We've shared ours, it's only fair." There was something in the way he said it, a challenge disguised as friendliness. The entire restaurant had grown quieter, with other diners watching the interaction. Margaret glanced at Sarah, who gave the slightest shake of her head. It wasn't that they were ashamed of their service or their accomplishments. It was that they'd learned long ago that some people would never truly understand or respect what they'd done. And these men, for all their years in uniform, seemed to be exactly that type. "We'd rather not," Margaret said simply. "Oh, come on," Rick pressed. "What's the big secret? Were you all privates or something? Hey, no shame in that. Somebody has to start at the bottom, right, boys?" His friends chuckled. The red-faced one, Dave, added, "Maybe they never made it past specialist. Lots of people plateau out." The condescension was now unmistakable. These men had sized up 5 older women and decided they couldn't possibly have had significant military careers. It was written all over their faces. Sarah felt a familiar emotion rising in her chest, not anger exactly, but a weary disappointment. After everything they'd done, after all the years of service and sacrifice, they were still being dismissed and underestimated. Diana's hand found Sarah's under the table and squeezed. It was a reminder to stay calm, to not let these men get to them. They'd dealt with worse than casual sexism at a bar. "Gentlemen," Patricia said, her voice cold and precise, "we've asked politely for you to leave us alone. We're trying to enjoy our meal. Please respect that." Rick held up his hands again, but his grin only widened. "Wow, touchy subject. Okay, I get it. Some people are more proud of their service than others. No judgment here, ladies. Support staff is important too. Where would we have been without someone to process our paperwork, right?" The insult was clear. He was suggesting they'd done nothing of importance, that their service had been trivial compared to his and his friends' combat experience. Jennifer started to rise from her seat, her face flushed with anger, but Margaret pulled her back down with surprising strength for a woman her age. "Not worth it," Margaret murmured. "Let it go." Rick and his friends were turning to leave, satisfied with their little display of superiority, when Tom, the former Navy officer, turned back with one more parting shot. "You know what?" he said. "I'll bet none of you ladies even saw combat. I bet you spent your whole careers stateside, pushing papers and serving coffee to the real warriors. Am I right?" The silence that followed was heavy and thick. Sarah saw the muscles in Diana's jaw clench. She watched Patricia's hands form fists on the table. Jennifer looked ready to explode. And Margaret, steady, unflappable Margaret, had gone very still. These 5 women, who had led soldiers into battle, who had made life-and-death decisions, who had scars both visible and invisible from their service, sat in silence while 5 mediocre men mocked them in a public restaurant. Sarah made a decision. She reached for her phone and began typing a message. Under the table, where no one could see, she composed a text to 4 specific contacts. The message was simple. Henderson's Bar and Grill, Fort Mason. Friday afternoon. You might want to see this. She hit send and placed her phone face down on the table. Rick and his friends were heading back to the bar, laughing among themselves, when Sarah spoke for the first time since they'd approached. "You know what?" she said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the table. "I think we should stay for dessert." Her 4 friends looked at her with understanding dawning in their eyes. They knew Sarah well enough to recognize that tone. She had a plan. "Yes," Margaret said slowly, a small smile forming. "I think we should. I hear they have excellent pie here." The 5 women settled back into their seats and calmly ordered dessert, while across the room, Rick and his friends continued their celebration, completely unaware that they'd just made a terrible mistake. Part 2. The Wait. The 5 women ate their dessert slowly, deliberately. To any observer, they appeared to be exactly what they seemed, a group of older ladies enjoying a leisurely Friday afternoon. But beneath the calm surface, there was a quiet electricity in the air. Sarah checked her phone discreetly. 3 of her 4 messages had been read. The 4th showed as delivered but not yet opened. She allowed herself a small smile and took another bite of apple pie. "Remember Fort Campbell," Diana said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of nostalgia. "That time the supply convoy got ambushed, and we had to improvise," Jennifer finished, grinning at the memory. "I don't think I've ever moved that fast in my life." Patricia laughed. "You should have seen the look on Colonel Peterson's face when he found out what we'd done. He didn't know whether to court-martial us or recommend us for medals." "He did both," Margaret reminded them. "The paperwork got lost in the shuffle, but I always knew." They continued sharing memories, their voices low enough not to carry to the bar, but loud enough to maintain the appearance of casual conversation. It was something they'd learned decades ago, how to communicate important information while seeming to discuss nothing of consequence. At the bar, Rick and his friends had ordered another round. Their voices were getting louder, their gestures more expansive. They'd moved on to telling war stories, each trying to outdo the others. "So there we were," Rick was saying, "pinned down by enemy fire, nowhere to go. I had to make a decision right then." "Let me guess," his friend Marcus interrupted. "You saved the day." "Damn right I did," Rick said proudly. "That's what leaders do, we make the hard calls." Sarah listened to them and felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel, a sense of satisfaction at what was coming. She wasn't a vindictive person by nature. In all her years of service, she'd never sought revenge or taken pleasure in someone else's downfall. But this was different. This wasn't about revenge. This was about accountability. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, 20 minutes out. Sarah showed the message to Margaret, who nodded almost imperceptibly. They'd worked together for so long that they barely needed words to communicate. "Should we order coffee?" Patricia suggested, her eyes twinkling with anticipation. "Excellent idea," Jennifer agreed. "I have a feeling we'll want to stay a while longer." The waitress, a young woman named Amy who'd been serving them attentively all afternoon, came by to refill their water glasses. "You ladies doing okay?" Amy asked. "I saw those men bothering you earlier. I'm sorry about that. If they're making you uncomfortable, I can ask my manager to." "That's very kind of you, dear," Margaret said warmly, "but we're fine. Actually, we're having a wonderful time. Could we possibly get some coffee? And maybe some of those cookies I saw coming out of the kitchen earlier." "Of course," Amy said brightly. "I'll be right back." As Amy walked away, Diana leaned in slightly. That girl has good instincts. She noticed the problem right away. "Unlike our friends at the bar," Patricia said dryly, "who have no instincts at all." The coffee arrived, along with a plate of fresh chocolate chip cookies. The women helped themselves, still maintaining their unhurried pace. Time was on their side now. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from a number she recognized. "Pulling into the parking lot now." Her heart rate picked up slightly, though her expression remained calm. "They're here," she said quietly. "All of them?" Jennifer asked. "The first one, at least," Sarah confirmed. Margaret glanced toward the entrance. This should be interesting. At the bar, Rick was in the middle of another story. "The thing is," he was telling his friends, "most people who serve never really see action. They go their whole careers without ever being tested. That's why I always say the infantry is where the real soldiers are. We're the ones who get our hands dirty." "Here we go," Dave said, raising his glass. "To the infantry, the real warriors." They clinked glasses, oblivious to the fact that their afternoon was about to take a very unexpected turn. The door to Henderson's opened, and a man in his late 60s walked in. He was tall and straight-backed despite his age, with close-cropped white hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore civilian clothes, khakis, and a button-down shirt, but there was something about the way he carried himself that marked him as military. He paused just inside the door, scanning the restaurant until his eyes found the corner booth. A smile crossed his face, transforming his stern features into something warmer. He walked directly to the women's table. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying a note of deep respect. "It's been too long." Sarah stood, and the man embraced her briefly before stepping back. "Thank you for coming, sir." "Wouldn't have missed it," he replied. "Your message was intriguing." He pulled up a chair from a nearby table and sat down at the end of the booth, positioning himself where he could see both the women and the bar. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the restaurant. People noticed him, though they couldn't have said exactly why. "How have you been?" Margaret asked him. "Can't complain," he said. "Retirement is treating me well, though I have to admit I miss the action sometimes." He paused, his eyes twinkling. "So what's this about?" Diana nodded toward the bar. "Those 5 gentlemen over there decided to join us uninvited about 30 minutes ago. They were very interested in our military service." "Were they now?" the man said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharpening. "Very interested," Patricia confirmed. "They wanted to know our ranks. They were quite insistent about it." "And what did you tell them?" "Nothing," Jennifer said. "We told them we'd rather not discuss it." "Which they interpreted as us being ashamed," Sarah added. "They assumed we'd been secretaries or nurses. Support staff, they called us." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. "I see." "They suggested we'd never seen combat," Margaret continued. "That we'd spent our careers stateside, pushing papers and serving coffee to the real warriors. That was the phrase they used, real warriors." For a long moment, the man said nothing. He simply looked at the 5 women sitting before him, women he'd served with, women he'd trusted with his life on more occasions than he could count. "And you want me to?" he prompted. "Just observe," Sarah said. "The others will be here soon. We're not looking to cause a scene. We just thought it might be educational." The man nodded slowly. "Educational, I like that." He settled into his chair, accepted a cup of coffee from Amy, and waited. The women continued their conversation, now including their new arrival in their discussion of old times and mutual friends. At the bar, Rick had noticed the newcomer, but hadn't given him much thought. Just another old-timer, probably. The restaurant was full of them in a military town like Fort Mason. 10 minutes later, the door opened again. Another man entered, this one slightly shorter but with the same unmistakable bearing. He spotted the group in the corner booth immediately and headed over. "Sorry I'm late," he said as he approached. "Traffic was murder." "No apologies necessary," Margaret said warmly. "We're just glad you could make it." He grabbed another chair and joined them. Now there were 7 people crowded around the corner booth. But no one seemed to mind. Rick was starting to pay more attention now. 2 older men joining a table of older women wasn't particularly unusual, but there was something about these 2 that made him uneasy. The way they held themselves. The way other diners seemed to instinctively respect their space. His friend Tom noticed it too. "Who are those guys?" he muttered. "No idea," Rick said. "Probably just their husbands or something." But even as he said it, he didn't quite believe it. There was something else going on. 5 minutes later, a third man arrived. Then, after another brief wait, a fourth. Now there were 9 people at the corner booth, 5 women and 4 men. The table had become crowded, with extra chairs pulled up and coffee cups being refilled regularly. Amy, the waitress, seemed delighted by the expanded party. "You folks need anything else?" she asked. "I think we're good for now, dear," Margaret said, "but thank you for asking." The 9 people at the corner booth talked quietly among themselves, occasionally laughing at shared memories. To any observer, it looked like a reunion of old friends, which in many ways it was. But at the bar, Rick and his companions were starting to feel uncomfortable. The 4 men who had joined the women's table had a presence that was impossible to ignore. They weren't doing anything threatening or even particularly noteworthy, but something about them commanded attention. "Maybe we should head out," Steve suggested. "It's getting late anyway." "It's barely 5 o'clock, Rick protested. "Besides, I'm not going to be run off by a bunch of old people having a coffee clutch." But his bravado sounded hollow even to his own ears. Something was wrong. He just couldn't figure out what. At the corner booth, Sarah checked her phone one more time. She looked at her 4 old friends and then at the 4 men who had answered her call. "Are we ready?" she asked quietly. "I think so," the first man who'd arrived said. "Though I have to ask, are you sure about this? We could just let it go." Sarah thought about all the times over the years when she'd let things go. All the small insults and dismissals. All the times she'd been underestimated and overlooked. And she thought about younger women who were still serving, still fighting those same battles. "I'm sure," she said. "Then let's do this," Margaret agreed. The 4 men stood up simultaneously, a coordinated movement that came from years of military discipline. They walked together toward the bar, where Rick and his friends watched their approach with growing apprehension. Part 3, The Truth Emerges. The 4 men approached the bar with measured, deliberate steps. Every person in Henderson seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. Conversations quieted. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even Amy, the waitress, stopped in her tracks to watch. Rick straightened on his bar stool, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. His 4 friends exchanged nervous glances. Up close, these older men were even more imposing than they'd seemed from across the room. The first man, the one with white hair who'd arrived at the women's table, stopped directly in front of Rick. He extended his hand. "Good afternoon," he said pleasantly. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Robert Chen." Rick shook his hand automatically, nodding the firm grip. "Rick Donovan, and these are my friends." "Marcus, Tom, Dave, and Steve," Robert finished. "Yes, I overheard your introductions earlier. Former Marine Major, Navy Lieutenant Commander, Army Captain, and Air Force Major. Correct." Rick nodded, surprised. "That's right, you've got a good memory." "It comes with practice," Robert said. "You see, remembering details about people is an important skill, especially when those people have made memorable impressions." There was something in his tone that made Rick's stomach tighten. The second man who'd arrived stepped forward. He was stockier than Robert, with a weathered face and intense blue eyes. "William Rodriguez," he said, not offering his hand. "I understand you gentlemen were very interested in military service this afternoon." "We were just making conversation," Marcus said defensively. "Those ladies at the table." "Those ladies," the third man interrupted, "happen to be old friends of ours. I'm James Williams, by the way." The fourth man, who had been standing quietly in the background, moved forward. He was the youngest of the 4, probably in his early 60s, but his eyes were cold and assessing. "And I'm Richard Clark. Now that we've all been introduced, perhaps we should have a conversation." Rick laughed nervously. "Look, if those women sent you over here to fight their battles." "Fight their battles?" Robert repeated, his eyebrows rising. "Oh no, son. Trust me when I say that each of those women is more than capable of fighting her own battles. They've proven that on more occasions than I can count. No, we're not here to fight for them. We're here because we were invited to witness something interesting. I don't understand, Tom said, speaking up for the first time. What's this all about? William Rodriguez smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. You wanted to know about their military service. You were very insistent about it, from what I understand. You wanted to know their ranks. We were just curious, Dave protested. Is that a crime? Not at all, James Williams said. Curiosity is natural, but you see, there's a difference between curiosity and condescension. You weren't just asking about their service. You were mocking it. You were belittling it. You assumed, based on nothing but your own prejudice, that these women couldn't possibly have had significant military careers. Rick felt his face growing hot. Now wait just a minute. No, Richard Clark said sharply. You wait. You had your chance to talk. Now it's our turn. The entire restaurant had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching the confrontation at the bar. Robert Chen reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. He opened it and held it up so Rick and his friends could see the identification card inside. General Robert Chen, he said quietly. United States Army, retired. Rick's mouth fell open. He stared at the ID, then at Robert's face, then back at the ID. William Rodriguez pulled out his own identification. General William Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps, retired. James Williams followed suit. General James Williams, United States Air Force, retired. Richard Clark was the last to show his credentials. General Richard Clark, United States Navy, retired. The 5 men at the bar sat frozen in shock. 4 generals. 4 men who had reached the pinnacle of military leadership, and they were all connected to the 5 women Rick and his friends had dismissed and mocked. Now, Robert said, putting his wallet away, let me tell you about those ladies over there, since you were so curious about their service. He pointed to Margaret Chen, who was watching from the corner booth with a serene expression. That's my wife, Margaret. Colonel Margaret Chen, United States Army, retired. She served for 32 years and commanded multiple battalions. She has 2 bronze stars, a silver star, and a Purple Heart. She was wounded in Afghanistan, saving 3 of her soldiers from a burning vehicle. The burns on her arms and back never fully healed, but you wouldn't know it to look at her because she doesn't complain. Rick felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. He looked at Margaret with new eyes, trying to imagine her in combat, leading soldiers, making life-or-death decisions. William Rodriguez pointed to Diana. That's my sister, Diana Rodriguez. Colonel Diana Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps, retired. She spent 28 years in the Corps, including 3 combat deployments. She was one of the first women to lead a Marine infantry company in combat. She received the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in Iraq when her convoy was ambushed. She single-handedly held off enemy fighters until reinforcements arrived, saving 17 Marines in the process. Diana raised her coffee cup in a small salute. Her expression was neutral, but there was steel in her eyes. James Williams gestured to Patricia. Patricia Williams, my wife. Colonel Patricia Williams, United States Air Force, retired, 30 years of service. She was a pilot, one of the first female fighter pilots in the Air Force. She flew combat missions in both Iraq and Afghanistan. She has multiple commendations for Valor and was nominated for general officer herself, though she chose to retire instead. Patricia smiled slightly. She'd heard this story before, but it never got old watching the realization dawn on people's faces. Richard Clark indicated Jennifer. Jennifer Clark, also my wife. Colonel Jennifer Clark, United States Navy, retired. 29 years in the Navy. She was a surface warfare officer who commanded 2 different ships. She served in hostile waters, conducted anti-piracy operations off Somalia, and received the Legion of Merit twice. She was also responsible for developing new tactical procedures that are still being used by the Navy today. Jennifer nodded at the men at the bar, her expression carefully neutral. Finally, all 4 generals turned to look at Sarah, who remained seated at the booth, calm and composed. And that, Robert Chen said softly, is Lieutenant General Sarah Mitchell, United States Army, retired. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Rick felt the blood drain from his face. Lieutenant General, 3 stars, one of the highest ranks in the entire military. She'd been sitting there the whole time, this quiet woman in jeans and a sweater, and she'd been a 3-star general. General Mitchell served for 35 years, Robert continued. She commanded at every level from platoon to theater. She served in Desert Storm, both Iraq wars and Afghanistan. She was the first woman to command an army division in combat. She has a Distinguished Service Cross, multiple Silver Stars, and more commendations than I can list standing here. William Rodriguez picked up the narrative. She planned operations that saved thousands of lives. She made decisions that changed the course of battles. She mentored hundreds of officers who went on to have distinguished careers of their own. She advised presidents, James Williams added. She testified before Congress. She helped shape military policy that's still in effect today. And she did it all, Richard Clark finished, while dealing with people who underestimated her at every turn. People who assumed, just like you did today, that a woman couldn't possibly be a real warrior. Rick wanted to disappear. He wanted to sink through the floor and never be seen again. His friends looked equally horrified. "We didn't know," Marcus whispered. "No," Robert agreed. "You didn't know. But that's the point, isn't it? You made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice and arrogance. You saw 5 older women and decided they couldn't possibly have done anything important. You dismissed them without a second thought." "We're sorry," Steve said, his voice barely audible. "Don't apologize to us," William said. "We're not the ones you insulted." He gestured toward the booth, where the 5 women sat watching. Sarah's expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, not anger, not satisfaction, but perhaps a quiet sadness. Rick slid off his barstool. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to walk across the restaurant to the corner booth. His 4 friends followed reluctantly. When they reached the table, Rick stopped. He looked at each of the 5 women in turn, really seeing them for the first time. He saw the strength in their faces, the confidence in their bearing, the depth of experience in their eyes. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Sarah directly, I don't know how to apologize for what we said. There's no excuse for it." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "You're right, there is no excuse for it. But I don't need your apology, Mr. Donovan. I've dealt with men like you my entire career. Men who assumed I couldn't do the job. Men who questioned every decision I made. Men who gave credit for my successes to the men who served under me." She paused, and Rick felt the weight of her words. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "I didn't serve for recognition. I didn't do it for respect from people like you. I did it because it was the right thing to do, because my country needed me, because there were soldiers who depended on me." Margaret spoke up. "We all did. We served with honor, just like thousands of other women who have worn the uniform. We didn't need to prove anything to anyone." "But you should have known better," Diana added, her voice hard. "You all served, you know what it takes, you know the sacrifice, and yet you still dismissed us without a thought." Patricia leaned forward. "Do you know what the worst part is? It's not the insult to us. We can handle that. We've handled worse. It's what your attitude represents, the idea that women in the military must be less than, that they must have had easier jobs, lower ranks, less important roles." "That attitude," Jennifer said, "costs lives. It keeps talented women from advancing. It creates a culture where people are judged by their gender instead of their abilities." The 5 men stood in silence, absorbing the rebuke. There was nothing they could say that would make this better. Finally, Sarah stood. She was shorter than Rick, but somehow she seemed to tower over him. "I hope," she said quietly, "that you'll remember this moment. Remember it the next time you meet someone whose appearance doesn't match your expectations. Remember it the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on assumptions rather than facts." She picked up her purse. "Ladies, gentlemen, I think we've made our point. Let's go." The 5 women and 4 generals prepared to leave, but before they could, Amy the waitress appeared with the check. "On the house," she said firmly, glaring at Rick and his friends. These heroes don't pay here. Robert Chen smiled at her. That's very kind, young lady, but we can pay. I insist, Amy interrupted. My grandfather served in Vietnam. He told me stories about people who didn't appreciate military service, who didn't understand sacrifice. These folks, she gestured to Rick and his friends, they just got a free education. The least I can do is buy you all dessert. The entire restaurant burst into applause. Diners stood up, clapping and cheering for the 5 women and 4 generals. Several people approached to shake their hands and thank them for their service. Rick and his friends slunk toward the exit, their faces burning with shame. But before Rick could leave, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Sarah standing there. Mr. Donovan, she said, I meant what I said, learn from this, be better, and maybe someday teach others to be better too. Then she released his shoulder and walked away, rejoining her friends who were being celebrated by the crowd. Rick nodded, unable to speak, and left the restaurant. Part 4, Ripples and Reflection. The story of what happened at Henderson's Bar and Grill spread through Fort Mason like wildfire. By Saturday morning, it was the talk of the town. By Sunday, it had reached beyond the small Virginia community to military bases across the country. And by Monday, it had become something larger than anyone could have anticipated. Sarah Mitchell stood in her kitchen, brewing her morning coffee, when her phone began to ring. It had been ringing almost constantly since Friday evening. Old friends from the service, former subordinates who'd heard the story and wanted to reach out, reporters from military publications asking for interviews, even a producer from a major news network. She'd ignored most of the calls. That wasn't why she'd done what she'd done. She hadn't exposed Rick Donovan's ignorance for publicity or recognition. She'd done it because sometimes people needed to learn hard lessons, and sometimes those lessons needed to be public. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Margaret Chen. Good morning, Sarah said, answering on the second ring. How are you handling all of this? Robert and I have been fielding calls all weekend, Margaret replied. Apparently, someone in the restaurant recorded part of the confrontation on their phone. It's all over social media now. Sarah sighed. She'd suspected as much. In the age of smartphones, nothing stayed private for long. Are you okay with that? She asked. I think so, Margaret said thoughtfully. Robert showed me some of the comments. Most of them are supportive. People sharing their own stories of being underestimated or dismissed. Women veterans talking about similar experiences. It's actually quite moving. Has anyone heard from Donovan and his friends? Funny you should ask, Margaret said, and Sarah could hear the smile in her voice. Rick Donovan apparently went home Friday night and couldn't sleep. According to his wife, who called me yesterday, can you believe it? He spent the entire weekend researching our service records. Sarah raised her eyebrows. Really? Really? She said he'd had no idea. She was actually quite apologetic. Said her husband can be arrogant sometimes, but he's not a bad person. She wanted us to know he's genuinely remorseful. That's something, I suppose, Sarah said. They talked for a few more minutes before saying goodbye. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee and thinking about the events of the past few days. Her doorbell rang. She opened it to find Diana Rodriguez standing on her porch, holding a newspaper. Have you seen this? Diana asked, walking in without waiting for an invitation. It was that kind of friendship. She spread the newspaper on Sarah's kitchen table. It was the local paper, the Fort Mason Chronicle, and the front page featured a large headline, Local Heroes Honored at Henderson's. Below it was a photo. Someone must have taken it Friday afternoon, showing Sarah and her 4 friends seated at their booth, surrounded by the 4 generals. They all looked dignified and proud, exactly what they were. The article detailed their service records, their accomplishments, and the incident at the bar. But it went further than that. It included interviews with other women veterans from the area, talking about their own experiences with discrimination and dismissal. It talked about the broader issue of recognition for women in the military. This is bigger than we thought it would be, Diana said, sitting down across from Sarah. Jennifer called me this morning. She said CNN wants to interview us. I know, Sarah replied. They called me too. I'm not sure I want to do it. Why not? Diana asked. This is important, Sarah. How many women serve without recognition? How many get dismissed and underestimated just like we were? Maybe we can use this attention to shine a light on that. Sarah was quiet for a moment. She'd always preferred to work behind the scenes, to let her actions speak louder than her words. But Diana had a point. This wasn't about personal recognition. This was about something larger. I'll think about it, she said finally. Over the next few days, the story continued to grow. Military blogs picked it up. Veterans organizations shared it on social media. The hashtag #RealWarriors started trending, with women veterans sharing their stories and photos from their service. On Wednesday morning, Sarah received a phone call from an unexpected source. General Mitchell, said a familiar voice. This is Colonel Amanda Foster. I don't know if you remember me. Sarah smiled. Of course I remember you, Amanda. You served in my division in Afghanistan. You were one of my best company commanders. How are you? I'm well, ma'am. I'm actually calling because I'm now teaching at West Point, leadership and ethics, and I was wondering if you might consider coming to speak to my cadets. Sarah was surprised. About what happened at Henderson's. About that and about your career. About what it means to serve with honor even when people don't recognize or respect it. These young cadets, especially the women, need to hear from someone like you. Sarah thought about it. She thought about all the young women who were following in her footsteps, who would face the same challenges and prejudices she'd faced. Maybe sharing her experience could help them. I'd be honored, she said. The speaking engagement was scheduled for the following month, but word spread quickly. Soon, Sarah was receiving invitations from other military academies, from veterans groups, from leadership conferences. Each invitation was a chance to tell a story that needed to be told. Meanwhile, back in Fort Mason, something unexpected was happening. Rick Donovan hadn't been able to shake the encounter at Henderson's. He'd spent days researching the 5 women he'd dismissed so casually. He'd read about their service, their accomplishments, their sacrifices, and he'd felt increasingly ashamed. On Thursday afternoon, he walked into Henderson's bar and grill and asked to speak with Amy, the waitress. I have a favor to ask, he told her. Do you know how to get in touch with those women, the ones from last Friday? Amy looked at him suspiciously. Why? Because I need to apologize properly, Rick said. What I said that day, there's no excuse for it, but I want them to know that I've learned from it, that I'm trying to do better. Amy studied him for a moment, then nodded. I'll see what I can do. The next day, Rick received a phone call from Margaret Chen. She suggested they meet at Henderson's, neutral ground, with plenty of witnesses if needed. Rick agreed immediately. When he arrived on Saturday afternoon, all 5 women were there, seated at the same corner booth. Rick's hands were sweating as he approached. Thank you for seeing me, he said, standing awkwardly by the table. I know you don't owe me anything. Sit down, Mr. Donovan, Sarah said, gesturing to a chair. Rick sat. He'd prepared a speech, rehearsed what he wanted to say, but now all his careful words seemed inadequate. I've spent the last week learning about your service, he began. All of you, and I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed of what I said, how I acted, and what I assumed. You've all done more for this country than I could ever hope to do, and I treated you with disrespect. Yes, you did, Jennifer said bluntly. I want you to know that I'm trying to do better, Rick continued. I've been talking to my friends, the guys who were with me that day. We've all been doing some soul searching, and we want to make amends. How? Patricia asked. Rick took a deep breath. I work for a defense contractor. We hire a lot of veterans, and I've realized that we have biases in our hearing practices. We tend to favor people who served in combat roles, especially infantry. We overlook people who served in other capacities, and we especially overlook women veterans. He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. I've put together a proposal for my company. New hearing practices that focus on skills and leadership rather than specific job titles. training for our recruiters on unconscious bias, a mentorship program specifically for women veterans transitioning to civilian careers.